Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Need Some Introduction. In today's episode, we'll be breaking down DTF St. Louis, the season series, mini-series finale. Sona, this podcast, our podcast, has become very popular around these episodes, which is interesting because I don't think this show, I can never really understand where these episodes can and do connect with our audience.
Right.
We just came off of a very successful run with Paradise, which I think was a less popular second season versus season one, but still very popular here on the podcast. But it was a very popular show. And this does not seem to be a very popular show, but really seemed to get a lot of traction. And I'll get into this into the conversation because I have a bunch of other questions to ask you first. However, that I do wonder if part of the reason the show got so popular is a bit of a weakness here in the finale, preview my opinions of this episode, in that I think our audience grew as people got more vested in the mystery. And then I guess the question is, was this really a mystery show at all? So I will, that's just a tease for what is to come in the conversation. And one more tease for everybody, I will break down for Sona some of the real world details of this true story that this is very loosely based on. So I'll have some of that at the end of our conversation as well. So stay tuned for all of that. But first, Sona, I wanted to ask you, how was your trip to Florida?
It was great. I have to say, I think we had really unusually bad weather for Florida while we were there. It was mostly cool, rainy, and windy. But on the plus side, since we were there to go to theme parks, maybe it kept the crowds away a little bit. And my son didn't seem to mind at all. He told me the rain makes him feel alive, which somehow in his 9 years of existence, he has become so blasé that he needs the rain to make him feel alive, which is a bigger question. But we made the best of it. And if you have a kid who's into Harry Potter, or if you are into Harry Potter, the execution of Harry Potter's Wizarding World is really amazing. They have done such a great job of making it an immersive environment that I actually haven't read the books since they first came out. I don't consider myself a huge Harry Potter fan, but when you enter into Diagon Alley, they've done such a great job that literally I gasped. It's amazing. So highly recommend Harry Potter's Wizarding World for anyone who's a fan of that.
So a few questions I had just specifically about that. Your son has seen all the Harry Potter films, is that correct?
He has seen, I think, the first 5, and he's made it through book 5. But he is a big YouTube kid, for good or for bad, and whatever that says about my parenting. So he is fully spoiled as to how everything turns out.
Oh, really? Okay. My daughter, ironically, has also just gotten to the 5th film, just finally got into Harry Potter this year. We tried to watch the first film multiple times. She just was not into it. We tried to read
they're really long, too.
They're very long, for sure. But once she got into it, she got into Stranger Things this year, and she was looking for something else that might be, kind of a world in and of itself that you can really get deeply into, the lore of it, which is interesting. I guess kids at this age start to look for that. And of course, Harry Potter kind of scratches that itch. Does your son have any awareness of the fact that HBO is going to have a full 8-season adaptation of all the books starting next year, and they're currently in production?
He is aware that it's happening, and for some reason, probably again due to YouTube, he has already prejudged it as being crap.
Oh, interesting. Wow. Okay, interesting. Last question is, what is his opinion on trans rights and intersex women?
Yeah,
boxing.
So it's a great question, and it's actually something that has not come up at all in our household. He is exposed to so many different things being a kid who goes to school in the city that there's not much that phases him. he's very much raised by us and in an environment that is super, super inclusive. We haven't talked about J.K. Rowling and what she said and the idea of separating the art from the artist. It's only third grade, so I feel like there is time to have those conversations, but right now that's not something that he's been confronted with. We just enjoy the Harry Potter story for what it is. I do think once you start that conversation of people's personal opinions and how we feel about them in the world of our morals and ethics, it becomes a very slippery slope to think about everything you enjoy.
Absolutely. And we've talked about it in multiple cases. We're going to talk about DTF this very episode, and then separating the personal story of David Harbour's story and his ex-wife, and the thematic overlap with this show, and how we really haven't discussed very much of it. And surprisingly, I brought it up, teased it in episode 1, because I thought that there would be more resonance between the two. Really hasn't been the case. But nonetheless, there is always inevitably the requirement to separate those things out. I actually just brought that up as a joke. I thought it was going to be like a laugh line, and I was even going to be like, JK, just JK. But you answered it sincerely. But it is, of course, complicated, right? Because we are watching the Harry Potters, and I do love those books and the world that she created. And then I have very complicated feelings with her opinions of things. And by the way, the worst part about it is I think oftentimes she raises legitimate points. I don't want to get too much into those topics,
right?
But there is ambiguity within that conversation to be had. And she raises legitimate points. And then I kind of defended her at the beginning, being like, well, if you just take the content of her thoughts, she's not necessarily being just overtly biased. And then, of course, over time, she's become such a troll. She can't leave it alone. She intentionally says antagonistic things. I'm like, she's not doing herself any favors if she wants to be taken as like an intellectual, honest broker. And maybe that's a lesson for people's social media hygiene, which people are so bad. It really concerns me, by the way, to tie it into other things I've discussed here on the podcast. I'm always trying to talk to my daughter and her friends, especially the ones who are slightly older, about having good social media hygiene, because it's so easy to be misconstrued online, and what you write versus what you say is there forever, and you should have some conscientiousness about what you're writing and how you're writing it, especially when it's written and not spoken. It's not conversational. It's maybe taken more literally, of course, because you're writing it. And someone who has written and built worlds and has been very influential with her, and for her to be so cavalier in the way she says things and then intentionally stoking, I feel like she, of all people, being someone who has created a giant fandom, a whole world that she's invented, that she doesn't see what she's doing, or I can't assume that she doesn't see what she's doing. She obviously is intentionally being trollish. And I think that undercuts her argument to a large extent. So I just think she's doing a really terrible job of managing her brand. And somehow Harry Potter is so massive that it's like you can't kill it, even with her, even though probably more than half of the fans of these books are against her, a lot of her beliefs. They still love this universe she created.
Yeah, I think it's really funny. You didn't think I would take that question seriously. Yeah, I think because it's something that I take seriously, it is something I have considered, but kids lose their innocence so fast these days that I'm really reluctant to introduce these ideas of analyzing other people's morals and ethics and how they are consistent or inconsistent with our own families any more than we have already had to, because I think it's a tough topic. I think there are so many things that I don't even do a deeper dive into, because it's kind of like, don't ask questions you don't want to know the answers to. You're enjoying this, just enjoy it and leave it be.
Meanwhile, our trip was interesting.
Yes, I was about to ask. Tell me.
Sure. I mean, it was pretty low key, which was great, just to get out. I was just talking to my wife about this, just the fact that sometimes just getting out of your routine, just getting away from your day to day. And we were able to stay at my friend's house. I've never spent a significant amount of time with this person, and my wife hasn't hung out with him for a long, has met up with him multiple times in the past decade or so, but not like to this amount of time. And they allowed us into their homes, and it was a pretty low key what we were doing. We went to the aquarium, and we went to the botanical gardens, and we went to the beach a couple of times. But that was all kind of part of our original plans were kind of undercut by the fact that my daughter got really sick. She got
Poor thing.
food poisoning or some kind of viral intestinal infection. And after we recorded last week, I brought it up briefly, she actually ate the next day and then threw up again. So we're like, okay, well, you don't have to eat. But then the next day she was afraid of eating because she had thrown up. And I'm like, we'll try to eat something. And then she had horrible gas pains. And I was telling her, you need to get out of bed and walk around and work this out. And the pain will go away. Now you just have gas pains because your stomach's so empty. But she was in so much pain. And my wife had appendicitis a couple of years ago. So we actually were like, God forbid we don't have this checked out. And the hospital was literally walking distance, although we did drive from the house we were staying at in Sarasota. And we went to the hospital, and she was in the emergency room. And of course, this was a very dragged out, multi-hour process, which I warned her of. And by the time they had her fully checked out, there was nothing wrong with her appendix. She seemed to be okay. Of course, the gas pains had subsided also, so she could actually walk across the street. And we went to Potbelly Sandwiches and had a sandwich. But but knock wood, this is like the first time she's ever been sick like this. So of course, for me, I know if I haven't eaten in a couple of days and then I try to eat, I'm going to have some pains, or I'm going to try to, prime the pump a little bit, eat some crackers to get things going. Because I've had this experience before. She has not, so she made some bad choices, and
oh no,
and she had some pain. But after the pain subsided that day, she went back to eating normally, and everything's fine now. So,
well, you know what? You'll remember this forever.
Yeah, exactly. And by the way, other than that, a couple of days of taking turns watching her while we were trying to have a vacation at the same time. She just laid in bed and watched TV for a while. We watched some movies with her. We had a good time. We went to the beach, beautiful beach there, and out on the quay, and we went to the aquarium, which is beautiful there as well. And and our hosts, I should say, were great. They took care of us the whole entire time, and would have been a very expensive trip without them. So thank you, Brian and Dara, if you're listening to this. I doubt you are. For hosting us. All right, Sona, let's talk about DTF St. Louis, episode 7. No one's normal. It just looks that way from across the street. A phrase we've heard multiple times here on the show. Do you want to break down the episode before we give opinions, or you want to give your opinion right off the top? How do you suggest we start this?
Well, I think we need to acknowledge how bleak this is.
Yes.
Before we dive into it further, because wow, this was really a downer. And not like this show up until last night had been so lighthearted, but it was somewhat comedic. And even last night was somewhat comedic. And I think the idea of it being a murder mystery also, I don't want to say it's lighthearted, but less depressing than what the outcome actually turned out to be. And I think while these ideas of commentary on middle age and loneliness have been threaded throughout, it's not like they just sprung them on us last night. Boy, they really went hard on that last night. And I just came away from it with such a sad feeling. I don't know about you.
Yeah, I agree. And I also was pretty disappointed with this episode. And I think part of it was, the reason I'd say that is because I, first of all, had prefaced our whole entire coverage here in episode 1 about the fact that I thought that episode 1 hinted at the fact that this was probably a suicide, and it would be exactly what we saw here, this different explorations of possible suspects, only to find out that either it was a suicide or at least some kind of self-neglect, and that, or minimally, that the truth of the matter was unknowable. And that's why I really felt kind of depressed the first couple of episodes of the show. So maybe it was because I sensed that so early on that I felt that when we get here to it here at the end, it wasn't enough, because as sad as this was, undoubtedly, of course, I think if you really were blindsided by the end point of this, it would be more impactful for sure. But I also feel like, given where we landed, the fact that we only spend those last few minutes in Floyd's final POV, which it seems like it really affected you, probably more, maybe again, I wasn't as affected by it, so maybe it did land for you. But I felt like we were still like introducing murder suspects in this particular episode until the last 10 minutes or so.
Yes.
So I felt like that's not enough time to spend. I know this would probably be, what I'm describing is maybe too depressing for people, but I would have preferred spending an episode with Floyd in his final moments and almost seeing the whole thing unraveling, and we could still have the police investigation, and tell me if this would land for you or not, but still have the police investigation where they are asking questions and then we are flashing into Floyd's. But I really want to have like a final reverie of time spent with Floyd and giving him, he's obviously a sad person, he's obviously a very caring person, and he's coming to this very difficult decision. But I feel it's kind of cavalier the way the show treats it. So to me, in a way, it's like I thought Floyd deserved better than what the show gave him here at the end.
I was not entirely taken off guard by the fact that he did this himself, partly because you're so good at figuring things out and you had to flag that from the first episode. But the context of it, what we were shown, was bleaker than I had imagined, even when you had raised the possibility. And I don't think I could have taken much more of that, honestly.
Yeah. See, I think that maybe that is, and that's a valid point. That's why I like having this conversation. For me, there wasn't enough there. But for you, like to your point, and maybe this is more where the audiences will land with this. I think I just looked at the very early reaction just this morning, because I just watched this very late last night. But we're preparing for 3 conversations today, by the way. So this is the beginning of 3 conversations we're going to have today on podcast. And I this is the first one I prepped for, so I'm a little multiple heads in a different show right now. But regardless, so I watched this very late last night. So I just watched read some of the social reaction today, and it seems to be pretty positive. So I think that maybe I'm in the minority here, and maybe to your point, maybe what I'm describing would have been too much of a downer at the end of this show. So maybe that's just a matter of taste.
I already took this really hard, so I'm not sure.
You could have taken more. Okay, yeah. Good. Well, then maybe I'm in the minority here. And by the way, I'm glad to hear you say that, because I still feel like recommending the show to people if they've waited to catch up with it, even though I honestly was pretty disappointed with the finale. And I felt like landing that point, because kind of these revelations were in the back of my mind the whole time, that I started thinking to myself, so what is this about? It's about the cops coming to the understanding that they misunderstood the clues. I'm like, we kind of got that, but it wasn't enough of a button on it. And I wanted more of the emotional closure, tragic closure that Floyd comes to. But maybe to your point, maybe that was too much for some people.
Definitely for me. Can't speak for everyone, but yeah, it was really rough to me, especially because I'm not just thinking about Floyd, I'm thinking about all of the main characters that we were shown, and just the outcome for all of them is really dark, in my opinion.
And that's kind of where I'm going as well. I think about the fact that when you spin out what happens to everybody at the end of this, of course, Floyd taking his own life, which is, and not accidentally, there was a version of this where he just is there, drank too much of this stuff, and he wasn't fully aware, accidentally almost did this, or that someone could have shown up there and shoved him against the wall and he had a heart attack because of taking this chemical. So there could have been almost like a combination of an accident. And there's ways where it would have mitigated some of this like intentional suicide with his basically signing I love you to his son at the very last moments, which is like so tragic in that way.
Mm-hmm.
So it's obviously extremely tragic for him. But then you think about Carol in admitting the fact that this was a suicide, or, not opening, basically agreeing with that theory of the case, has forfeited potentially receiving her insurance claim, and Clark losing his friend, acknowledging that this is a suicide, which of course is devastating. We know that Clark is really as lost as Floyd was, although presenting in a very different way. And that's an interesting parallel between the two of them that we need to talk about as well. Of course, the whole dancing scene in the boathouse, the pool house, and him coming home to an empty house, to these women, his daughters and his wife, who he's been neglecting this whole entire time. And we got to talk about how strange it is that we really never got any kind of Emmy POV at all.
So
in this
strange.
show.
Yeah.
Very strange. And another thing that bothered me a little bit, I feel like the show has introduced different suspects. And in a way, so many people, including people who've reached out to us, have speculated that Emmy was definitely involved because of her absence, right? And the show, again, is very much intentionally making us think, well, it's got to be her. Every time we see her, she has this like questioning expression on her face. And it's only like 3 times in the entire show. Why are they keeping her hidden away? And I think the show is intentionally, by omission, making her a suspect in what is to come. And again, I felt like that was maybe detracting a little bit from the payoff, that this was really the story of this middle-aged guy who is so lost in his middle age, has so much lost a sense of himself, that he finds this to be like the only way he can provide for his family. But to your point of how depressing this all is, he's not leaving money to his family. He's abandoning them. He's abandoning his wife. So he's never going to be able to repair that relationship. He's abandoning his son. He's abandoning his friend. It's not at all giving any kind of closure to these people. They're all worse off at the end of the show, which of course makes it much more. But I feel like the show, in ending in that final moment where Clark is just walking into the house and to that empty house, we don't have enough time with those characters to feel the full weight. For me, I don't feel like there's the feeling of that full weight. But again, in your opinion, maybe you really didn't want to deal with all that at that moment. It was too much. Understandably, of course, right?
Yeah. I think you make a fair point regarding the underdevelopment of that character. And clearly, now that we see how it all turns out, it was like an artistic choice, I guess.
Yes.
But it is a strange one. I guess the real focus was Jason Bateman and his whole situation. And so they didn't feel the need to give us more on that side.
We spent all this time talking about the very ending, but I do want to touch on a couple of earlier moments. Okay, first of all, of course, the episode itself is called Everybody Looks Normal from the Other Side of the Street, or something to those. I can't remember the exact term. It's quite a mouthful. And of course, this goes back to the whole modern love and his philosophy, and also what the detectives talk about at the very end of how this is how the suburbs are, according to Detective Plum. Anyway, this is how the suburbs are. Homer, we find out, is, as I like what she describes, that he is so normal in his sexual tastes that he is strange in being so absolutely square at his picadillos. Not that some of her suggested sexual fetishes that she outlines there are mainstream at all either.
Yeah.
But apparently she has watched a lot of this alternate pornography, I guess. But the couple of funny points here, of course, they start to verify the cases that they've built and now deconstructing them themselves by continuing to explore them. And in the one regard, we have this, they're able to track down. Oh, by the way, you watch Abbott Elementary. I didn't realize this actor's from Abbott Elementary.
Yes.
Right? The Tiger, or the would-be Tiger persona. They keep calling him Tiger, which is funny because, of course, Bateman's profile is the actual Tiger one. And that they track him down. He verifies the story. He did meet with Modern Love, of course. He said, I met some guy at a roller skating rink. And I had predicted that there were going to be some kind of reference callback to that weird turn of phrase. And of course, he does speak it. And then Jason Bateman goes, hey, I heard that before too. And of course, that all circles back to proving that he did meet with Modern Love. And he did have a sensory hand-holding experience at the roller skating rink, which I found very funny that, I guess you can have any kind of experience on DTF St. Louis, even just holding hands while you roller skate at the roller skating rink. And some of this is cute. And I guess, again, it is to explain the fact that people can be lonely and can want different experiences in different ways. So it's all interesting and valid and resonates with the rest of the show in general. And then a few other things that we speculated on as well. Oh, of course, they start to exonerate Carol as well. We know we predicted this as well, that when even just one episode ago, we were thinking, what is the show teasing with this criminal record that this woman has? But we know that's not going to pay off either. And of course, it did not. Turns out it's just some minor shoplifting when she was younger, which again feels like a detail that we didn't necessarily need this late in the going. So all of this was rubbing me a little bit the wrong way, to be honest. Specifically in this case with the file of her criminal record, her sealed record.
Well, I guess it goes to the construction of some sort of mystery about her and what her motivations may be and whether she had anything to do with this thing.
Right.
With Floyd, and then the reveal of what actually happened contributes to the bleakness of it all.
Yes, for sure. But then, of course, they are still playing with who could be the suspect here. We finally get very flippantly, just an aside, about how we find out about the penis injury, which is just that Richard, in the middle of the night, because Floyd had gotten into a fight with Carol, that Richard had overreacted when he was younger and had hit him with a baseball bat while he was sleeping. And that had been where the trauma had come from. And he just says this like, oh yeah, and just kind of throws it to the side. And of course, the argument, this does tie into that interview in Chicago because she was furious with him about not taking the job and instead deciding his real calling was to sign, and how this depresses her as well. And we got to talk about Carol, actually, because there's a couple of really interesting character moments here as well. But all that, I bring that all up because they are even here seeding the fact that, oh, it was Richard and he flipped his lid and he has the bike, because that's another clue that gets revealed here, and it must have been him on the night of, and he had another one of his violent freakouts, and we literally see him have some kind of episode in this very episode of TV. So all of this is setting him up to be potentially another victim. And again, like I said, this felt like very 11th hour. We had a very non-eventful episode last week, I should say. They could have introduce some of these suspects then if they wanted to. I'm complaining about the construction of the show is what I'm coming down to. And I would have liked to have had a coda to the show rather than having still spinning out alternate murderers, detective stories until this late in the game. Before I forget, I want to talk about Carol and some revelations there, because we do see some really nice touches to her after setting her up as this real femme fatale episode after episode, and the horrible way she treated Floyd when he tried to be intimate with her last week. So we do humanize her here, and I did like that as well. But before I forget, I do want to get into a big theme of the show, and of course, directly to ask you, as given your previous career, that there is, I think the big theme of this show is that there is oftentimes, because we watch a lot of TV, because we watch a lot or read a lot of detective fiction, watch a lot of these documentaries about true crime, there are narratives we have in our heads. And because of those narratives, we oftentimes see people as perpetrators when reality might be uglier, messier, more complicated. And then we hear these narratives that don't make sense, like in this show. We're like, well, that's a weird explanation for that. But maybe the real world is more complicated and tricky. And the reason I asked that, of course, is because at one point in your career, you were very involved with exactly this, right? The exoneration of folks later on. And do you think that is something that actually happens during investigations, that oftentimes the detectives will have a version of reality, will fit the clues and the evidence into that narrative, and then, of course, present that in court? And we are used to hearing those narratives. And of course, the parents did it. Of course, the husband did it. Makes perfect sense. And sometimes, in your personal experience, the facts are silly and stupid and not generic in the way you would expect. And people go to jail for crimes they didn't commit.
Interesting question. So, okay, people definitely go to jail for crimes they didn't commit. Absolutely. My prior work was actually not with exonerating people, but with getting them compensated for their wrongful conviction after they had been exonerated. But in connection with that, you learned a lot about what had happened previously and how they ended up in prison. So I will say, there's this idea of when you hear hoofbeats, think horses, not zebras. I might be fracturing that a little bit.
Correct. Yeah.
And so probably 90% of the time, the most logical answer, maybe more than 90% of the time, the most logical, obvious answer is the correct answer. What I found in the specific situation of these individuals that I worked with that had been exonerated is that, and this is a much deeper dive than I think you intend to get into, but there is a culture within law enforcement that can think that even if the person you are convicting didn't do this particular thing, he is not a good person, and he definitely did something at some point. So you are doing a greater good for society by putting this person behind bars, even if it's not for this specific thing that he is going to prison for. So then, yeah, there is a lot of looking the other way on evidence that contradicts your theory of what happened and trying to kind of fit a square peg into a round hole onto when it comes to other things. The cases that I worked with were really quite egregious in that there was almost always eyewitness testimony that exonerated the person, or in one case, somebody was convicted for a murder uptown here in the city when he had two people saying he was in Florida with me on that day at that time. There was actual proof. He was in a whole other state over 1,000 miles away. So I have seen really egregious things happen. I don't think those things are the norm, but I also don't think it's surprising for people to be convicted of crimes they did not actually commit. Does that answer your question, or did I just go off on a tangent?
No, I think you did. And that's what I was curious about, was that especially, and I think the reason I bring it up is because I do think the show here does undercut, again, I'm being a little critical here, but I did overall enjoy the show, undercut itself a little bit for some tangentially to what some of the points you just made, in the fact that it's not always, there are zebras, it's not always horses. So maybe look closer, this idea of looking closer, right? And maybe that just because you're jaded and you've seen this 9 out of 10 times, maybe examine your prejudices each time. And maybe that's a good thing for all of us to have as well. Don't prejudge as much. But I think the show undercuts things a little bit when it comes up with the silliest possible explanations for everything, right? And we'll get into it. I don't want to get into it just yet, but the pool house scene was irritating to me, honestly, for the fact that we are now in that moment being like, okay, Jason Bateman is showing up there because he has actually fallen in love with Floyd. He is actually discovering something about his sexuality.
Yes.
And then for it to just be undercut yet again, why? Or do we need to do this yet again, pull another punch where it's like, no, he hasn't fallen in love with Floyd. He's actually like, I thought that might be what's going on with me, but I'm actually not attracted to you. Again, which is just another, inadvertently, of course, just another way to hurt Floyd's feelings. He doesn't intend to do that. But it's just like, why even introduce this? I mean, the show could have been more courageous and just simply said that he had fallen in love with him. That's it. He had been attracted to him.
Actually, there was a good chunk of this episode where I was kicking myself for us not discussing that idea.
Yes.
previously, because I did feel they were telegraphing that.
Right.
And we just got caught up in discussing other aspects of the show.
Right.
And I was very annoyed with myself for not bringing it up, because I did feel like they were planting the seed for that. But then, as you mentioned, it all turned out to kind of be not quite a red herring, but not actually what was happening.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. It seems so silly in that moment where Clark is not attracted to him, but he's kind of like, oh, I can do this for you if you are attracted to me. And it boosts my self-esteem as well, right? And that, exactly like you said, I felt the same way I was watching it, going, oh, that's what this show's been about. It's actually been about Clark, who's doing all these different sexual experimentations just to come to this realization about himself. And that is where the show was going, which would have, I think, been an interesting place for the show to go at that moment.
I agree.
And then they pull their punches again. He's just like, actually, now that I've thought about it and now that I'm presented with it, this isn't actually what I want. And I'm like, okay, then again, I started thinking to myself, what is this show about? Just the fact that we shouldn't judge, like that things can be messy. Again, I think that's why I asked you that question about your personal experiences, that the fact that, yes, I think it is interesting to think about how your preconceptions can be wrong oftentimes, but the show is coming up with the most convoluted way to keep just presenting more possible theories that I'm like, okay, you're undercutting your own intentions, I think, at this point.
Yeah, I will also say, just based on a story construction perspective, we watched those two men dance in their underwear for a very long time. For not go someplace homoerotic.
Yeah, and then you knew that, like, literally at that moment when this is just dragged on, and it doesn't become. At first, I thought that it's going to start this way, and this is how they end up like discovering this attraction to each other, or at least maybe one direction or both. Who knows, right? And I thought maybe that's where the show is going. That they're like accidentally coming to this revelation. But then when they were just like dancing around in their underpants and describing each other's physical features that they like and whatever, I'm like, now the sun's going to show. This is just another convoluted way to get him to be in an awkward situation in front of the kid, right? So it just became it just was so bizarrely convoluted unnecessarily. And then let me say something complimentary about the show, but then also about how silly and convoluted, just to show the tension there between the two things. Let's talk about Carol for a moment. So we see this really sweet, I like that these two guys are being interviewed side by side, like the two exonerating witnesses. And this young kid, 15 years old, who's actually her boss. And that even though we kind of saw him as this jerk scrolling his phone and not paying attention to her, he gives her umpire of the year because she did a great job of being an umpire, because she was always kind of taking care of the kids. And that's what really being the umpire of the year was, which I like that detail. It also makes her a much sweeter character than we've seen, like more a conniving version of her from these men's perspectives throughout the course of the show. So I think that added some detail to her. I liked her singing to herself. She has another fun song that we can add to our playlist about getting new furniture for her son, and her son so enthusiastic, so happy that day of riding his bike to school because it'll be the cool thing to do, which is like, is it really? I don't know about that. And him coming home and being so excited to have the new furniture in the house. So all of that is really nice. And then it's somewhat undercut by the fact that all of that, which is very nice, is to be that, oh, actually, I delivered the Umpire of the Year award at her house because I'm the newspaper boy and I normally wouldn't approach the house, but because the lights were on, I did. And then I saw her sitting there exactly when she potentially could have been committing this murder. So I'm like, okay, so this has all been set up again, this very sweet character detail to set up this the murder mystery aspect of this, which again, I feel like the show should have almost abandoned the murder mystery aspect by this point. There's a question in there somewhere, but what did you think of Carol, the way they treated Carol here in humanizing her, but also how they set up this, alibi for her here as well?
I liked that they showed this additional dimension to her character I wish we had seen just a few shades of that before last night.
Yes, agreed. They have her as a straight up femme fatale.
Yeah,
Until,
it seemed like an important dimension to know about before the last episode. So I appreciated it, but I also would have liked to have seen maybe just one or two other actions beforehand that lined up with that. Although I guess you could say being a parent to a son with these types of issues tells you that she must have that capability, but still, I would have liked to have seen a little bit more of that. I did think this was kind of a funny way to tie the whole umpiring thing into the whole plot of the show with the award and the paper person and all of that. It did help my interest, though. I'll give them that.
a lot of the show resonated with me, like the whole midlife crisis.
Sure.
But my question for you is, as a woman, and I think the audience for this show, I haven't seen, I'm speculating here, but I do think that, and part of that is because most of the reactions we've had specifically to this show has been from women on the podcast. And our podcast, just so everybody knows, our podcast is very much like 50-50 women and men. And sometimes, it's strange, like even if I'm covering a show that I think is going to be mostly men watching it, it'll get to maybe 60-40% men. And then sometimes, like we watch The White Lotus. Very funny, by the way, that you look at the actual breakdown when The White Lotus coverage begins. At the beginning of the coverage, it was definitely more female than male. And then by the end of the show, it's 50-50, maybe even a little more male. So just interesting how the dynamics sometimes change. But Paradise, for example, which I would presume might be, because it has science fiction elements to it,
Right.
that it might be more male, really was like a 50-50 split. So we always get a very split audience here on the podcast. But the reactions I've been seeing are mostly from women. So I do wonder if this show skews female. And the reason I ask you that is, how do you think this show treated its female characters? Because I think it actually is very empathetic about all these things about men, body image issues, of course, and, that men have as well, and not being the breadwinner as you approach middle age, losing cultural touch, not making friends, all these things, and not feeling useful, like even Clark, who is famous and makes good money, but he feels like, I have a useless job. So all things that, of course, this are universal, I think, as well, but I think very coded for males in general, but I'm sure women have a lot of these issues as well. But how did you think this show, which probably appealed more to women than men, as true crime in general does, how do you think it treated its female characters? Emmy is completely sidelined, right?
Right.
The daughters have no perspective at all, literally non-characters, other than like just appearing as fuzzy figures here and there in the show. And Carol is only given any kind of perspective at all in the final moments, other than just being a foil to the male characters, someone like Clark lusting after her potentially manipulating Clark through sex, her potentially or constantly disappointed with Floyd being a large part of the reason Floyd kills himself. And honestly, that's pretty, and they really don't fully flesh her out as a character. She still is pretty much a device here in the show. And the only character that kind of is an empathetic female character is probably Plum herself. But that character, honestly, could have been a male character. I'm glad that they made her a female character, because they have that, she gets to be a little bit of the Greek chorus here on the show. But it's like, how do you feel that? Do you think the show is neglecting a female perspective, period, in general?
That's an interesting question, especially because that's something that I usually am paying a lot of attention to. And I think you're making a valid point about the underdevelopment of those characters. I think for me, that wasn't the story the show is trying to tell. Right. Mm-hmm. So I am giving it a wider berth or excusing it more than I would normally, because I don't think it's representing itself as telling the stories of those people. I think this really is Floyd and, gosh, I'm still calling him Jason Bateman right to the end. Floyd and Clark's story. More, somewhat Carol's story, but I don't think that's what they're really trying to tell. I don't think We did have the one episode that was kind of from her perspective where we see how she hung out at the Jamba Juice all day. But still, I don't think that's what this show was trying to do. So I'm excusing it in that I don't think that you have an obligation to tell everyone's story that's a character in the show. I think you can choose. And I don't think there's any obligation to give equal time to a man's story and a woman's story. I don't think we have enough women's stories. That's a whole different issue and a different conversation. But it didn't bother me here.
Yeah, I'm not saying that a show has to be one thing or the other, just to be clear on that as well. Like, for example, I watched The Housemaid on the airplane, and it's minor spoilers for that. When you just have this male character that is either just a straight up fantasy of a knight in shining armor, and then of course inevitably turns out to be like the worst person on earth, and there's no psychological explanation for that character. It simply is just a device in the plot. That's totally fine. It could be a horror movie or a thriller or a Lifetime movie of the week, or just even something that's more prestige where it's just about women in a friendship with each other. That's fine. Like in The White Lotus, let's talk about just the women in the most recent season. And of course, there are very well fleshed out male characters in that show. But from the point of view of those three women, the men are just there to be like whatever, sex objects or devices for their own friendship dynamic. That is totally fine. The show does not have to be balanced across the board. I just was wondering from your perspective specifically here that you do have a show that is about these men's friendship, but then you do have a very important female character who is there just to play the femme fatale. And by the way, in film noirs, there's plenty of women who are just femme fatales and purely devices. But the fact that Carol gets so much screen time, but then we really don't have any alternate perspective on her until this very last episode, I felt was a little like shorthanding her a little bit. So I was just curious to get your opinion of it. I honestly didn't bother me because, like you said, the show is really about these two guys and finding friendship late in life, and how in a way that ray of sunshine, to reference the sunshine reference throughout the course of this show, is actually detrimental in the end, right? Because it doesn't fulfill all their emptiness, which of course is incredibly depressing when you think about it from that perspective. But that this show about this friendship of these men actually leads to one of them dead is not a great message. Yeah. But I think it's interesting, and I thought that the show itself was very interesting. I just thought that it was very lumpy and didn't need to be. I think they could have fixed things with a stronger final episode, and I was kind of disappointed, to be honest. Is there anything else you wanted to bring up on the show before I talk to you about a little bit about the real world analog here? Anything I might have missed?
No, I think we've covered all of it. I'm just kind of thinking about it in my head right now. Yeah, I think we've covered everything, and I just generally come away feeling depressed and unsettled.
Conrad, the actual creator of this show, in an interview just the past couple of days, given this, was talking about how the Floyd felt a responsibility to, and this is where I feel like maybe this is tainting my opinion of the show as well, that this was like a responsibility of Floyd's to off himself, to fix the situation around himself. And I don't buy that, because in what way, I guess in his mind, if he can believe that he is giving, and you touched on this earlier when we theorized that this might be suicide, that he is setting up, actually, I'm sorry, I take this back. This is actually one of our listeners who emailed me about this. She had a theory that, and maybe I brought it up on the podcast already, she had a theory that Floyd is trying to set up Clark and Carol so that they might have a life after him. This was all kind of his plan. But then, of course, he inadvertently framed them for murder. So I didn't really know if he really thought this out, if he was truly setting them up. And worse than that was the whole, like, I'm going to set up this life insurance policy. And maybe that would have been a more interesting version of the story for me, where if he had left something behind, like a suicide note. No, he can't leave a suicide note because then he can't get the life insurance. So yeah, see, it's very complicated that if he wants them to collect the life insurance, then that doesn't work. And then he's inadvertently, by them setting up this life insurance policy, makes it look like they are committing a murder. So Floyd has not planned this outright. If he is trying to sacrifice himself, which of course he's set that up, right? That he is someone who's always wants to be giving. He doesn't fight back. He's always trying to minimize himself, which of course is ironic given his size, that he is always trying to minimize himself to allow other people to thrive. And of course he does that in the end here. But is he doing that? He's abandoning his family. He's not giving them any kind of financial security. He's abandoning his friend, which is a very important relationship to him here late in his life, which has really re-energized him. So it doesn't seem like he has thought this out very well.
You know what was also not well thought out? If he didn't want to kill himself, why did he pour so much empathy in a can? That was very reckless.
Yeah, again, because this is completely made up, you can imagine if this was something like a Viagra, that you might, like he was saying, you might want to have it close to when you want the effect to take effect. But yeah, like you said, when he pours that, I honestly, when at the beginning, early in the episode, when he's pouring that entire thing into the Bloody Mary, it seems like he is preparing for that suicide even ahead of times. And maybe that is subtext here. Maybe we have to consider that this is all part of, there's a chance where if this thing doesn't go well for him that day, that he is planning to kill himself. But again, if that's the case, he's not thinking of the fact that, hey, I just set up this insurance policy for myself in Carol's name, and it looks very sketchy that now I end up dead. But this could look like an accidental overdose, right? And that in and of itself could have allowed this loophole that it looks like an accidental loophole, but there's so much, I should say accidental overdose. But if that's the case, then there's all these weird red herrings. Again, the show is only making me think about all these things because it has set itself up as a whodunit. So now I have to actually follow the clues, because if he really wanted to do that, he could have just as easily done it in his living room the next afternoon, where there was no weird, sketchy 4:00 in the morning meeting. When Carol was at work, he could just be like, I'm feeling sick today. And then he drinks the stuff and they find nothing in his system after the fact. And they're like, that's weird. He just died. Oh, and there's a life insurance policy. That's it. And this is all much simpler. But that's not the show we got.
That's not where we ended.
And we wouldn't have watched that show anyway. So we gotta take it as is. Okay, so here is some details around the actual show. And I'd recommend anybody who's curious about this, do check out this article, which was written in 2017 in the New Yorker, I believe it was. And the article was called My Dentist's Murder Trial, Adultery, False Identities, and a Lethal Sedation. That's the name of the article. And it's still available. You can just type it in and you'll find the New Yorker article that talks about this. And I think I mentioned this to you, Sona. I started reading the case before the show ended, maybe about 2 or 3 weeks ago. And at first I'm like, this has nothing to do with DTF St. Louis. So I can read the whole entire thing. And it was only in the last section of the article that I started being like, wow, there is a lot of really bizarre stuff that happens in this case. But it's very different from this case. So this guy who writes this article, his dentist, it turns out, has been accused of a murder. And apparently he goes and talks to his dentist when he gets released from jail, but he still has further trial dates to come. And he starts talking to him about it. And the dentist is more than happy to talk to him about this. And basically there's a full interview about the cases of this case. And the dentist's name was Gilberto Nunez. And what it turned out was this guy had a lot of emotional problems. He had he attempted suicide before. He had a bad marriage, a bad breakup. And so he seemed to be a very erratic character, but eventually became friends with this family, a husband and wife, and started to have an affair with the wife. And at some point, she broke it off and said, I want to work things out with my husband and I want to end the relationship between us. And he freaked out about this. But through this relationship with the wife and his continuous codependency on this relationship in this family, he actually ended up becoming friends with the husband as well. And some really weird stuff happens. He at one point told the wife that she couldn't break up with him. He was like an undercover CIA operative. He had fake IDs that showed him to be this other character. So we see a little bit of this where Clark claims to have this other business, and he does these explosions off the coast for underwater treasure hunting, I guess. So there's these big fish stories that he has that kind of correlate loosely with this story. Now, the really bizarre thing that happens is at some point, and by the way, at one point he creates a female character, a female fake persona, and starts to try to catfish the husband into cheating on the wife as a way to get the wife back. So that's a bizarre kind of little bit loosely, again, overlapping with the details of this show. So there's a lot of weirdness there. Now, eventually, the guys become friendly with each other beyond the scope of the relationship with the wife. But when you see the actual text messages, the wife and husband are like, the Nunez will call the wife and be in a really bad place. And then the husband and wife are texting back and forth about it. And they are like separated at different times. Their marriage is not going cleanly, but they're still living together and there's some issues there. But then the men become friendly with each other. And then here's where things get really bizarre at the very end of the article. The night of the murder, or I should say the death, they meet at so there's some meeting at Planet Fitness at 4:00 in the morning.
Okay.
So the husband, who ends up dead, drives to Planet Fitness, which of course is open 24 hours, and is parked outside. And you can see it on the CCTV cameras. Then you see a car that matches the description of Nunez's car driving from approximately where his dentist office is on the highway. This is 4:00 in the morning. There's very little traffic. And you can see he has like a truck, and one of the lamps of his truck, the fog lamps, was broken. So it's like pointing downwards. So you can follow this weird light on this car from approximately where the dentist's office is all the way to the Planet Fitness. Now, the two cars are parked next to each other for 28 minutes. We can't see into the cars. We just see the headlights. So they're parked next to each other for 28 minutes. It seems like somebody got out of one car into the other car. The next morning, the victim here is found in his car, and he is dead. He has a chemical in his system that you can get for a dentist's office. It's a sedative. It can be dangerous to people who have heart conditions, but is relative. It's Versed, by the way, is I think the more common description of this drug. But it's not really a deadly drug unless, it can be, it's a sedative. So if you have other heart conditions, if you're on anything else that might reduce your blood pressure, there could be some complications. So it wouldn't really seem to be the thing you would do to kill somebody, but it's extra bizarre because A, what were those guys doing in the car together? Second of all, the dead gentleman, his pants have been unbuckled and his zipper was pulled halfway down, but the police said that was like staged to make it look like it was a sexual act. Basically, he wasn't unzipped enough or his pants weren't out enough to have had any kind of sexual contact. So it seems like it was staged. So who is staging this to make it look like it was a sexual episode? If this guy just died in his car, seems like a very strange set of events. More bizarre than that is the fact that theoretically, even though it very much looks like their cars, these two cars are parked next to each other and is definitely the other guy's car. I mean, what a huge coincidence if this isn't the other guy's car that literally follows door to door when they go to all the traffic cameras. It matches the path that he would take. They're there for half an hour. This guy ends up dead the next morning. What were they doing parked next to each other? But stranger than that is they went and looked for his DNA in the car. They never did a full DNA screening for whatever reasons for the other guy's DNA, but they did look for DNA in the car in general, and they found only the wife and the driver's DNA. So there doesn't seem to be any other DNA from anybody unidentified. So was he in the car? Because where's his DNA if he was in the car? and what was happening and why did they meet and how did this guy end up dead? Is it just all coincidence? Because according to the dentist, he was not there that night. And there's always a chance that another car that looks exactly like his followed that same route. We see it kind of here paralleled with the two bikes out at the same time. So it could be some bizarre coincidence, but is it? That there's a lot of weird coincidences, and it gets weirder than that. Sona, here's the other weird part that only comes out at the very end of the article. It turns out these guys became so buddy-buddy that, check this one out. By the way, this guy was pretty obese, which is a little odd for the next fact I'm going to say, just because, maybe if you're going to try to hook up, this isn't the type of guy that you would choose to be your match. But, people have different tastes for different types of people, so who knows? But anyway, the dentist had a profile for the other guy on a dating site, which is like Get Nasty. It's another off-brand hookup site. It's like getnasty.com or some weird, URL. I don't remember exactly what it was, but definitely not one of the, not Tinder or something, or even like Adult Friend Finder, like one of these more commonly known websites, but just some weird getnasty.com or some bizarre local, maybe website, very similar perhaps to DTF St. Louis, some made up URL. But regardless, so he has a profile for his friend. So he is using this profile on his own to get sexual hookups, to get women to hook up with this guy. So he is setting up dates. He's pimping out his friend. So that's the other question people said is maybe, possibly what happened was that they pulled up in those cars. Maybe he picked up one of these women that he had been from these sketchy website they were on to hook up with the guy. And maybe he died during just coincidentally during the interaction. But then the question is, where's the other DNA, the foreign DNA in the car? They don't find any. So it goes back to the idea that this all looks like there's something really sketchy going on, but maybe it was something innocent. But if it was something innocent, what's the script? What explains the bizarre night of activities between these two guys, right? So again, I think it's more what is the theory of the case in these bizarre set of circumstances that is an inspiration for this particular show rather than any of specific details of it. But it is a very interesting case because I don't think you can, going back to the idea that you can just write a very simple narrative about this, I don't think you can really explain all the details in that real world case either. So maybe that's part of why this show struggles to connect the dots, because maybe it's very hard to connect those dots in any rational way. Yeah, and if anybody's curious about that case, I have not, by the way. This case is from 2017, so there may very well have been more evidence discovered or more research just from online sleuths who did their own discovery afterwards. So there may be a lot more details on this. I'm just going on that case, or I should say that article written in 2018, and I have way more questions about what the hell happened there than even with this show. So that's the real world inspiration for this show, in case anybody was curious. All right, Sona, I guess we will record later today about Your Friends and Neighbors, episode 2. And we will, I don't know when I'm going to publish that. I'll probably publish that a little bit later because Darren and I watched Euphoria season 3 after a 4-5 year wait between seasons. We are going to talk about the first episode of Euphoria, and that show is still a hot mess. But I got to tell you, I'm kind of curious about. I was like, we're going to watch the pilot, and we're not going to watch the rest of the show. I'm kind of curious about what they're going to do with that show this year, I got to say. So anyway, we'll talk about that. So expect that episode, or the podcast episode discussing that tonight. And then Sona and I's conversation about Your Friends and Neighbors, with a great twist at the end of episode 2. So very curious to see how things pick up. Didn't love that episode, by the way, but I did love that twist.
Not at all.
Can't wait to talk to you about that one. Wow, what a rough episode, but what a great twist at the end. So we will talk about that and publish that a little later this week. And then, of course, we'll be back on track again. We'll be talking about Your Friends and Neighbors. Kim and I will be talking about The Pit, which wraps up this week. That show's also become very popular here on the podcast, so happy to have you guys jumping on. And then, we'll see what I can keep talking to Celia about. Oh, and of course, Sona, I buried the lead. I should have started with this. this week, I have this whole week off to myself, despite, all this backlog of episodes I have to publish. And we're launching the Patreon this week, everybody. So
Nice.
we'll be, anybody who's emailed me before, I'll be reaching out to you directly with the new Patreon information. And if you haven't reached out to me before via email, just keep listening. And later this week in one of the episodes, I will tell you how to get to the Patreon. All the content, they'll be free temporarily. But then, hopefully you'll get hooked on that content and start paying for it in the future.
We can only hope.
And so stay tuned for all of that later this week. All right, Sona, I guess I'll be talking to you very soon, but thanks for this conversation. And we'll talk again very soon.